God made everything good. But then an enemy appeared. He became the serpent. He told the first lie. Don't trust your God. The lie evolved. We changed your day of rest. Forget the Sabbath. We are the authority now. The whole world followed.
He did not want to destroy the Sabbath, he wanted to replace it. That is the plan, not to abolish the day God blessed and sanctified at the very foundation of the world, but to slide a counterfeit into its place so quietly, so gradually, so convincingly, that the whole world would never notice the switch had been made. And according to prophecy, it worked, almost everywhere. But here is what most people have never been told: the change was never hidden. It was boasted about, documented, claimed openly as proof of authority that no human being was ever given. This is the story of the most audacious substitution in religious history, and the final act has not happened yet. Before we talk about laws and governments and the courts of men, we need to go further back than the 1880s, further back than Constantine, further back than any council or cathedral or papal decree. We need to go back to the moment when the enemy made his intentions known, not in a whisper but in a declaration. There is a war behind this story, and it did not start on earth. Think of it this way. Imagine a master artist who paints a signature into every work he creates. Small mark, unmistakable, hidden in plain sight, that says, "I made this." God did the same thing at creation. He worked for 6 days, and when he rested on the seventh, he did not simply stop working. He signed the canvas. He sanctified that day, blessed it, set it apart from all others as a living memorial, a sign between himself and the people he would call his own throughout all generations. The Sabbath was not a rule. It was a signature. "Verily my Sabbaths ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you." Exodus 31:13. And the enemy saw that signature and made a decision. He declared openly, "I will work at cross purposes with God. I will empower my followers to set aside this memorial, this seventh-day Sabbath. My goal is simple. I will obliterate the memory of it from the minds of the people entirely. I will place in its position a day that does not carry God's credentials, a day he never blessed, a day that cannot be what the true Sabbath is, a sign between God and his people. And I will lead everyone who accepts this substitute to pour onto it the very sanctity God placed on the day they have forgotten. That is not interpretation. That is not speculation. That is the stated strategy of the enemy of your soul. And what makes it so devastating is that it is not a strategy of force. It is a strategy of substitution. He did not come to smash the Sabbath. He came to replace it with something that looked almost exactly the same, that filled the same space in the week, that felt like worship but carried a different signature. The difference between the true and the counterfeit has always been the difference between life and death. Even when both look alive, the signature was placed. The memorial was sealed. But the enemy's shadow was already moving across it. The question is, how exactly did he pull it off? And who did he use to do it? Every great forgery leaves a fingerprint. The most skilled counterfeiters in history have always been undone not by the quality of their work, but by the small, unavoidable mark they left behind. The detail that does not quite match, the admission that slips out when no one is looking for it. What happened to the Sabbath is not a mystery buried in silence. It is a documented substitution, and the fingerprint is still on it. The prophet Daniel, writing centuries before it happened, described a power that would arise and do something no human being has any right to do. He said this power would speak great words against the Most High. He said it would wear out the people of God. And then he said something so specific it almost doesn't seem possible. He said it would think to change times and laws. Think about that. Among all the commandments God ever gave, only one deals with time. Only one tells you when. The fourth commandment, the Sabbath commandment. And this power would think to change it. That is exactly what happened. The day of rest was moved from the seventh day, the day God sanctified, to the first day of the week. Not by Scripture, not by any command from Christ, not by any instruction from the apostles, by human authority, acting in the place of God, claiming the right to alter what God had set. And here is the part that should stop every Christian in their tracks. The institution that made this change did not hide it. They admitted it. They still admit it today. Of course, the Catholic Church claims that the change was her act, and the act is a mark of her ecclesiastical power and authority in religious matters. Read that again slowly. They are saying, we changed the Sabbath. We did it. And that act, that change, is the mark of our authority. They are not embarrassed by this. They present it as proof of power. The very thing that most Christians today treat as sacred, the Sunday Sabbath, is openly claimed by the church that introduced it as the mark of its own authority over Scripture. Not God's authority, its own. Now, and this is important, this is not a condemnation of the sincere men and women in every church who worship on Sunday with all their hearts. God sees the heart. He knows what light a person has received. The testing time has not yet come. There are genuine followers of Christ in every denomination, including those who have never heard this history. But sincerity has never been the standard of truth. A person can be sincerely wrong. And when the full light of what God requires is placed before them, the sincerity of the past cannot carry the decision of the future. That is why this matters. That is why this conversation must happen. The Protestant world received this child of Rome and called it sacred. Revelation describes this as fornication, spiritual compromise, nations drinking from a cup that was never filled by God. And the God who said, "My Sabbaths ye shall keep," has not changed his mind, regardless of how many centuries have passed since the change was made. The fingerprint is there. The admission has been made. The evidence is in plain view for anyone willing to look. But knowing the history is one thing. What happens when governments start enforcing it? There is a temptation when we talk about end-time prophecy to place everything safely in the distant future, to look at the warnings and think, yes, someday, eventually, after I am long gone, all of this will begin to unfold. But prophecy does not always cooperate with that comfort. Sometimes it shows up at your door before you think it is ready. It was already showing up in the 1880s. More than a century ago, a concrete movement was forming in the United States to enact Sunday laws. Laws that would compel the observance of the first day of the week as a sacred day. Not in theory, not in prophecy pamphlets, in actual legislative chambers, in newspapers, in petitions signed by thousands. The movement was real, it was organized, and it was accelerating. And God's people were warned. This is not the time to sit down and fold your hands. What is remarkable about this movement is that most of the people inside it had no idea what they were actually building. They genuinely believed that enforcing Sunday rest would heal the moral decay of society, that crime and corruption were connected to the neglect of the Sunday Sabbath. They were not evil people. They were blinded people, and that is one of the most sobering truths in this entire story. You do not have to be wicked to be used by darkness. You only have to be uninformed. Think of a river whose surface looks calm. A swimmer crossing it might feel the gentle current and think, this is manageable, I am fine. But underneath, a powerful undertow is moving in a direction the swimmer cannot see, toward rocks, toward danger, toward something the calm surface never revealed. The Sunday law movement had that kind of undertow. On the surface, morality, community, a shared day of rest. Underneath, the slow reconstruction of the very system of church-state power that once filled the dungeons of the Dark Ages with people who refused to comply. The instruction was not passive. God's people were told to pray, to write, to speak, to vote, to do everything in their power to delay the advance of religious compulsion for as long as possible, so that the gospel could go to more people before the door closed. They were told plainly, "We are not doing the will of God if we sit in quietude, doing nothing to preserve liberty of conscience." Fatalism dressed up as faith is still fatalism. God does not honor the posture that says, "Prophecy will fulfill itself anyway, so I need not act." God's people were not called to be passive spectators of prophecy. They were called to be its faithful witnesses. But there is something larger than activism that this story demands we face. What happens when a nation officially crosses the line? There is a prophecy in Revelation 13 that has puzzled readers for centuries. It describes a beast that rises with two horns like a lamb, gentle, peaceful, republican in nature. It speaks of a nation that comes to power not through conquest, but through the promise of freedom. A nation that looks like a lamb but eventually begins to speak like a dragon. Every student of history and prophecy who has looked carefully at this text has seen the profile of the United States of America. And what makes this identification so serious is what the prophecy says this nation will eventually do. It will cause the earth and all who dwell in it to worship the first beast, the power that was wounded, the power whose authority was claimed by the system that changed the Sabbath. And the mechanism of that compelled worship, according to the prophetic record, is the enforcement of Sunday observance. When the United States enacts a national Sunday law, it will in that moment join hands with the very system whose authority it was born to resist. Protestantism will have formed an image to the hierarchy it once fled across an ocean to escape. Here is the parable of the bridge. A great bridge stands between two shores. One the shore of freedom, one the shore of tyranny. For generations it has held. Its builders understood what made it strong: the separation of the two shores, the clear space of water between them, the principle that the weight of religion must never rest on the frame of the state. But one day, slowly at first, a group of people begin to lay boards across that water, not to cross it, but to close it. And they do not realize that every board they lay is one more step toward the collapse of the bridge they were standing on. This has one name: national apostasy. Not political mistake, not poor judgment. Apostasy, a turning away from the very principles that made the nation what it was. And it says something more. National apostasy is the signal for national ruin. Not a gradual decline, not a slow erosion, a signal. The same way the Roman armies approaching Jerusalem were a signal to those who had read the warning. The moment the Sunday law is passed, the limit of God's forbearance has been reached. Political corruption does not announce itself. It works in the shadows of public approval. Rulers and legislators, seeking votes, seeking favor, yielding to the loudest voices in the room, will make this decision without understanding its weight. They will call it morality. They will call it unity. They will call it good for society. And the very act of calling it good will be the measure of how completely they have been deceived. The United States does not act in isolation. What happens here sends a signal around the world, and the world, every nation, every tongue, every people, will receive that signal and respond to it. History has a pattern. When a great power makes a decision, whether righteous or wicked, the world watches and follows. It happened with the spread of democracy. It happened with the spread of empire. It happened with the spread of the Reformation, when one man nailing pages to a cathedral door ignited a fire that spread across a continent. And according to prophecy, it will happen again one final time, with the enforcement of Sunday, not as a national law, but as a global one. As America, the land of religious liberty, leads the world into this new covenant between church and state, every nation on the globe will follow its example. The prophecy is not vague about this. It uses words like all nations in every country and the whole world. What begins as a domestic policy will become an international standard. The most powerful nation on earth will have demonstrated that it can be done, and the rest will do it too. Not all at once. Not by the same mechanism. But the direction will be the same everywhere. Compelled worship, enforced uniformity, and a world that calls it righteousness. Revelation describes what this moment looks like from heaven's perspective. It calls it a universal bond of union, every power, every government, every nation, giving its strength to the same beast. Not because they are all conspiring in a secret room, but because the same enemy who declared his strategy in the courts of heaven has been executing it across centuries, through institutions and traditions and sincere people who never knew they were part of a plan larger than themselves. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is prophecy. And it is as old as Daniel. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. Revelation 17:13. And when this substitution becomes universal, when every law, every court, every government on earth exalts the first day of the week and makes the keeping of the seventh day a crime, that is the moment God acts. Not before. Not in the middle of the buildup, when some have but others have not crossed the line. When the substitution is complete and universal and the choice is clear for every person alive, God will reveal himself. He will rise in his majesty, and what happens next will be the undoing of everything the enemy thought he had achieved. All of Christendom will divide into exactly two groups, not by denomination, not by baptismal records or theological positions or how many years someone sat in a pew. By a single decision. Do they keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus, or do they yield to the beast and his image and receive his mark? There is no middle ground at that moment. There is no third option. There is no "I have not decided yet." The pressure of the hour will make neutrality impossible. Every person alive will be counted on one side or the other. The line is global. The division is total. And every person watching this will be in that world when it happens. Which raises the most personal question in this entire story. What does God ask of his people in the middle of it? There is a kind of courage that looks like fire but acts like foolishness. And there is another kind of courage, and quieter, harder, more costly, that looks like patience and acts like wisdom. God's people in the time of Sunday law pressure are called to the second kind. Not to rage, not to provoke, not to wear their convictions like weapons, but to live them like roots, invisible underground, unmovable in the storm. The instruction is plain. Do not fly into a passion over this matter. Do not show defiance. Do not boast unwisely of your liberty. The servant of God is not called to be a provocateur. He is called to be a witness. And a witness who spends his energy inflaming the opposition is a witness who has made himself the story, instead of making the truth the story. When Sunday laws begin to press in, the wisdom of the hour is to give the opposition no handle to hold, no occasion to call you a lawbreaker, no reason to dismiss the message because of the messenger's temper, and something remarkable is offered in its place. The very day the enemy has set up as his tool can be turned into an opportunity. Sunday, under a Sunday law environment, can become the most powerful missionary day the church has ever known. Open-air meetings, house-to-house visits, writing and distributing truth, singing that reaches people who would never walk into a church. Every closed door that the law creates on one side becomes an open window on another. The enemy's tool, placed in the hands of a willing people, becomes the vehicle of the very warning it was designed to silence. Refraining from ordinary work on Sunday is not the same as receiving the mark of the beast. The mark is about compelled worship, the deliberate knowing choice to honor the false Sabbath after the truth has been clearly revealed. It is not a passive default. It is not what happens to a person who simply grew up going to church on Sunday without knowing the history. God does not condemn what he has not yet clearly illuminated. The mark comes at the moment of clear light and deliberate rejection, and the moment has not yet arrived for most of the world. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. 1 Peter 2:17. Live this verse in both directions. Honor the king, respect human government as a divine institution as long as it stays within its legitimate sphere. And fear God, because when human law and divine law collide, there is only one authority that has the final word. The beauty of truth becomes most apparent when it is most opposed. Every objection raised against God's commandments opens a door for the truth to be presented with a power and clarity that comfortable seasons never produce. Wisdom in the face of pressure, patience without surrender. But there comes a moment, and every faithful soul throughout history has faced it, where wisdom runs out of road, and only one thing remains, a line that cannot be crossed. There is a moment that comes in every great story of faith, a moment when the options run out, when diplomacy has been exhausted and wisdom has been applied, and every possible path of peaceful navigation has been tried and closed. When the demand of the hour is no longer be wise about this, but simply choose. Daniel's friends faced it in front of a golden image on the plain of Dura. Daniel faced it with a window open toward Jerusalem. The apostles faced it before the Sanhedrin. And every martyr across every century of Christian history faced it at their own particular moment of reckoning. That moment is coming for the people of God in the final crisis. The choice will be this: yield the word of God and accept human tradition, and you may still live among men, buy and sell, maintain your standing in society, or maintain your loyalty to God and forfeit everything the world values. There is no version of this choice where both can be kept. The pressure of the hour will make that impossibly clear. And the answer that God's people will give is the same answer that has always been given by those who chose Him when the cost was highest. We ought to obey God rather than men. Acts 5:29. That sentence has cost people their property, their families, their freedom, and their lives across the centuries. It has been spoken in dungeons and before thrones and in the open air. It is not a complicated sentence. It contains no theological terminology, no philosophical qualification. It is simply the statement of a person who has decided which authority is ultimate and is willing to pay whatever that decision costs. Thus saith the Lord cannot be replaced by thus saith the church. It cannot be replaced by thus saith the state. The crown of Christ rises above every diadem of earth. The enemy's offer has never changed. He offered the kingdoms of the world to the Son of God Himself. All of this, all the power and comfort and security the world can give in exchange for one act of surrender. Many people accept that offer. They sacrifice eternity for comfort. They choose safety today and find that they have purchased ruin forever. But the answer that comes back from every soul who has chosen God over kingdoms is simple, and it does not require eloquence. It is better to die than to sin, better to want than to defraud, better to hunger than to lie. This is not a new line in the sand. It is the oldest line in the story of faith. And the God who asked His people to stand on it has never asked them to stand alone. Every martyr who ever kept the faith in darkness discovered in that darkness a presence they could not explain, a peace that made no sense given the circumstances, a strength that had no human source. The disciples were not endowed with martyr's courage until the moment the courage was needed. And neither will God's people in the final hour. The grace arrives with the trial. It has always been that way. Here is what this episode has shown us. The change of the Sabbath was not an accident of history. It was not a gradual cultural drift that nobody noticed. It was a declared strategy, executed across centuries through institutions and traditions and sincere people who often did not know what larger design they were serving. The enemy did not need everyone to be wicked. He only needed them to be comfortable. Comfortable with the substitute. Comfortable with the inherited tradition. Comfortable with a worship that felt right but carried someone else's signature. The final test of loyalty to God will not be buried in some obscure corner of theology. It will be visible. It will be legal. It will be global. Every person alive will face it, and the question at the center of it will not be complicated. Whose authority do you recognize when the authorities of earth demand that you choose? The answer to that question will not be determined in the moment of crisis. It will be determined right now, in the quiet of ordinary life, by the choices we make about what we believe, and who we trust, and what we are willing to pay for truth. The same God who signed his name on the seventh day at creation has not forgotten what he wrote. He is not unaware of what was done to his memorial. He is not surprised by the drift of nations, or the compliance of churches, or the slow advance of the very crisis he predicted. He told us it was coming so that when it comes, we would not be shaken. We would recognize it. The Sabbath is not just a day, it is a sign. And the God who gave that sign to his people said something that has never expired. I am the Lord that doth sanctify you. The line has been drawn. The choice has been made. But choosing God over man has never come without a cost. In the next episode, we follow those who made that stand into the courtrooms where the judges refuse to listen, into the days when no one can buy or sell without the mark, into the places where every earthly support is stripped away one by one. We will discover what happens to people who lose everything for God, and what God does about it. That story is coming, and it is one that every person alive in the last days will need to know by heart.